Video editing isn't always a linear process. You're not always starting from the beginning of the video and editing through chronologically until the end. But this first assignment isn't meant to be some complicated multi-scene production. It's effectively a three-piece puzzle. To start, I'll drag the Griffin graphic into the timeline panel from the project panel. I want to be sure that it lines up with the beginning of the timeline. If I didn't and tried to export this video, I'd have a few seconds of blank screen to start with. Image files like the Griffin typically have a duration of 5 seconds when brought into a timeline, but they can be stretched as long or trimmed as short as you want, unlike a video clip which has a fixed maximum runtime. I already demonstrated how I added markers and an in and out point to my self-introduction clip, so I'll go ahead and pull it from the source panel and drag it down here into the timeline. If you didn't set in and out points on your clip, you'll likely need to call up the selection and razor tools to trim it down. As you click and drag the end of a clip, a little readout will appear that shows you the amount of change and the clip's new duration, both as timecodes. If you want to set a specific duration for an image without manually dragging the ends of the clip, you can right-click on the clip and select Speed/Duration. The window that appears gives you the option to change its duration in terms of a percentage, but you can also click the timecode and enter a value like I described when explaining the source panel. Hit OK, and the clip will change accordingly. To demonstrate, I'll use that feature to set this graphic to have a duration of 4 seconds even. After that, I need the second graphic, the one that the video will end with. There's no need for an additional file though. I can either drag it in again from the project panel, or I can duplicate the one I've already got in the timeline. I can select the graphic, hit Ctrl+C to copy it, move the indicator down the timeline, and hit Ctrl+V to paste it. The clip will be pasted with its first frame occurring wherever the indicator is set. If you're not careful, the pasted clip could overlap with another in the same track and accidentally trim that chunk of the existing clip. Another way to duplicate the graphic is to hold the Alt key and drag the graphic up and over, then release the mouse button and the Alt key to produce an exact duplicate that can then be edited independent of the first. Now's as good a time as any to talk about saving your work. Premiere does have an autosave function, but I recommend you make a habit of manually saving your work. You can do that either by going up to File and hitting Save, or simply hitting Ctrl+S. To undo something, you can go to Edit, Undo, or press Ctrl+Z. Moving on to the transitions. Use the selection tool to make sure there's no gap between the 3 items in the timeline. Then, go to the top right corner of the project panel and click the double arrow icon and select Effects to call up that tab. I tend to use the Effects tab a lot when I'm editing, so I'll typically click and drag it to sit next to the Project tab, or even move it up to sit with the source panel for easy access. These effects are divided into several categories. I want to add a transition that will fade the graphic to reveal my video clip and vice versa, so I'll open Video Transitions and then Dissolve. There are a few options, but I'm going to use the one called Cross Dissolve. I'll click and drag it over to the timeline panel and drop it at the point where my first 2 clips meet. Before you apply the transition, you'll see that I can drag it left or right to alter the timing of it, relative to the point where the clips meet. Do I want it all the way on the left, all the way on the right, or centered? If you've left any frames between a pair of clips though, you won't be able to bridge them with a transition like this. You also won't be able to apply a transition like this if they're in separate tracks. The gray box that appears over the clips indicates the frames across which the chosen transition will occur. Just like any other clip, you can use the selection tool to trim or extend transitions and slide them left and right. You can also right-click on a transition and select Set Transition Duration, and from there, use the manual timecode entry trick. For a 1-second transition, you'd simply enter 100 for 1 second and 0 additional frames. If I wanted it to be a second and a half, I'd enter 115, since my sequence is 30 FPS, so 1 second and 15 frames. The reason I suggested you include some cushioning on both ends of the self-introduction was to allow some flexibility when working with transitions. Transitions between images can be as long as you like, because the images themselves can be stretched to practically any duration. Video clips are a different story. Video clips are finite when it comes to available frames. You may notice when using the selection tool that you can't extend a video clip past the bounds of the original file's beginning and ending points. There's simply no more information to work with. Likewise, transitions aren't meant to be stretched beyond a video clip's available frames. It's possible in some instances, but Premiere will be forced to repeat frames, which can be really distracting. It's better to have a bit more footage than necessary than not have enough. The criteria for this assignment only ask for transitions between the graphics and the self-introduction, but I'm going to apply one at each end of the sequence, just to demonstrate that transitions don't require a clip to have another one next to it to have the transition applied. That only matters when you want to transition from one clip directly into another one. I'll drag and drop the effect titled Dip to Black. Technically, since there's nothing else on either end apart from the graphics, I could just use a cross dissolve, but it's good to play around with the other options just so you know what's available. If I were to apply Dip to Black between two clips instead, you'd see the frame fade all the way to black, then fade in the second clip, instead of fading directly from one to the other like with a cross dissolve. Alright, if you've been following along, your digital name tag should be good to go. It's simple enough, but I still recommend you watch through it once or twice more just to make sure everything's working correctly. Transitions are there, they're working properly, everything's timed the way you want it. If your playback's a bit choppy, Premiere might need to process pieces of the sequence a bit more. Over top of the timeline is a colored line. Areas marked in yellow indicate that Premiere may not be able to play that section back properly as is. You should watch it for yourself though to see if extra processing is needed. A red section means that Premiere can't play that section properly without more processing, or rendering. To render your video within the timeline and improve playback, select Sequence from the menu bar and select Render In to Out. I set an in and out point on my video clip back in the source panel, but I don't currently have any set within my larger sequence. You don't need to set those points though if you want to render the whole sequence. If there's no in point set, Premiere will render from the start of the sequence, and if there's no out point, it'll render to the end of the sequence. Before wrapping things up and exporting your video, be sure to grab that timeline screenshot mentioned in the assignment criteria. Think of it as showing your work like you might do on a math problem. Start by clicking and dragging the ends of the scroll bar at the bottom of the timeline panel until your completed sequence fills the visible timeline. Hit the Windows key, which should be near the spacebar, and enter either Trim or Snip in the search bar. An application called Snipping Tool should show up. It's a built-in screenshot tool, so go ahead and open it. In the Snipping tool, click the fourth icon from the left and make sure Rectangle is selected. With your project open beneath the Snipping tool, press the plus New button and click and drag to draw a rectangle around the timeline panel, then release the mouse button. Go back to the Snipping Tool app and you should see your screenshot. Right-click on it, hit Save As, name it in the manner listed by the criteria, then save it to your video production or digital name tag folder. Once you've reviewed your video, you can move on to exporting. With your sequence rendered and your project saved, go to File, Export, Media. You could also select the Export tab found below the menu bar. Under Settings, enter the name of your finished video. Set it to be saved to the appropriate folder, and make sure the format is set to H.264. This is a specific video codec, which is essentially a set of instructions on how the video will be compressed and how it'll handle audio and video. H.264 is just an MP4 file, and it's a standard that's used on a lot of platforms. Open the Video Settings dropdown and click the button that reads More. Scroll down until you find the slider titled Target Bitrate. Bitrate is a measure of the rate at which data is transferred or processed over a period of time, which in our case translates to the image quality of a video. Higher bitrate means higher file sizes, so let's knock the target bitrate down to around 5. Most people won't notice the difference anyway, and it saves some time on the back end. You should see the change reflected in the estimated file size listed under Output on the right side of the window. Below the video preview is a drop-down labeled as Range. If you have an in or out point set in the timeline panel, the range might be set to source in/out. If you don't change that to entire source or work area, Premiere will only export the part of the sequence contained between those points. Be aware though, that if you have any stray clips further down the timeline, say you split a larger clip and forgot to delete the excess at the end, that will change what qualifies as your work area. I've had people ask why their 2-minute video was being exported as a 7 or 8-minute video, and it turns out they had a stray bit of video hiding at the far end of the timeline, extending the sequence's effective duration. Check the output readout in the bottom right corner to ensure that your resolution, frame rate, and video duration are all correct. 1920 by 1080, 24 or 30 FPS, and, well, video duration depends on your video, obviously. From here, you can hit the export button and let Premiere do its thing. You won't be able to do anything else in Premiere until it finishes, but there's an alternative if you want to get a jump on another project. In addition to Premiere, you can access a piece of software from Adobe Creative Cloud called Media Encoder. It's a video and audio processing application, and if you select Send to Media Encoder from Premiere's export window, a copy of your sequence will get kicked over to Encoder. You can then let Encoder handle the processing and leave Premiere available to use for editing. Whichever route you choose, the time spent waiting for the video to be finished is a good opportunity to knock out the first quiz. Remember, each quiz is due at the same time as its corresponding assignment. If you've already knocked out the quiz, you might look ahead and start considering the next assignment, the show and tell video.